There is something about Keanu Reeves that goes beyond the action hero we see on screen, something that touches the very core of what it means to be human in a world that often forgets humanity. Watching him through the years has taught me that true strength is not in the punches thrown or the villains defeated, but in the quiet moments when no cameras are rolling and a son simply holds his mother's hand. Keanu inspires me because he shows us that success without kindness is empty, that fame without family is hollow, and that the greatest role any of us can play is being there for those who were there for us when we had nothing. His story reminds me that we all carry hidden battles, secret sacrifices made by those who love us, and that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply show up with gratitude in our hearts. The morning light felt different somehow as it filtered through the dusty attic window, catching particles in the air like tiny memories floating in space. Keanu stood still for a moment, breathing in the scent of old wood and forgotten time, his hand resting on a cardboard box that seemed to pulse with an energy he could not name. His mother, Patricia, was downstairs, humming softly as she packed dishes into bubble wrap, unaware that her son had just discovered something that would change everything they thought they knew about their past. The box felt heavier than it should have as he lifted it, and somewhere deep in his chest, a feeling stirred like a bird testing its wings after a long winter. Inside the box were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to him in handwriting that seemed both foreign and familiar. The paper was yellowed with age, some envelopes bearing stamps from 30 years ago, others more recent, but all of them unopened, all of them hidden away like guilty secrets. Keanu picked up one letter dated from his 10th birthday, then another from when he won his first movie role, and another from just 3 weeks ago. They were all signed the same way, with initials that meant nothing to him, yet everything to someone who had chosen to keep them buried in this attic tomb. Patricia found him there an hour later, surrounded by the scattered evidence of her deception, tears running down his face as he read words that should have reached him decades ago. She stopped in the doorway, her hand flying to her mouth, and in that moment she looked smaller than he had ever seen her, as if the weight of her secret had finally crushed the armor she had worn for so long. The silence between them stretched like a tightrope, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper carrying 30 years of hidden pain. She told him everything then about Margaret Reeves, his grandmother who he had been told died when he was young, but who had actually been writing to him all these years from her home in Hawaii. The family feud that Patricia had described as ancient history was actually a careful construction, a wall she had built brick by brick to protect him from something she believed would destroy his innocence. Margaret had wanted to be part of his life, had begged and pleaded through every letter, but Patricia had made a choice that now sat between them like a canyon neither knew how to cross. The latest letter was different from the others, its urgency bleeding through the careful handwriting like a scream in a library. Margaret was dying, it said, and she had one final secret about Keanu's father that she needed to share before it was too late. She wrote about forgiveness, about truths that had been buried beneath lies meant to protect, about a burden she could no longer carry alone into whatever came next. Keanu looked at his mother, this woman who had been his rock and his companion through every red carpet and every lonely night, and saw her not as the villain of this story, but as another victim of choices made in desperation and love. Patricia collapsed into an old chair, her body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs, from a place where mothers store the pain they never let their children see. She told him how his father had been involved with dangerous people, how Margaret's connection to him had put everyone at risk, how she had made the impossible choice to cut her own mother out of their lives to keep Keanu safe from men who would use family as leverage. Every letter she had hidden had been a knife in her heart. Every birthday Margaret missed had been a wound that never healed. But she had carried it all because that is what mothers do when the world threatens their children. But Keanu saw something else in those letters, something Patricia had been too afraid to see. He saw a grandmother who never gave up, who kept writing even when silence was her only answer, who somehow knew that one day her words would find their way to him. He saw love that refused to die despite being buried alive, hope that continued to bloom in the darkness of rejection, and a faith that family bonds could survive even the deepest betrayals born from protective love. As the sun began to set through the attic window, painting the dust motes gold like tiny angels dancing in the light, Keanu made a decision that would change 3 lives forever. He would go to Hawaii, he would find Margaret, and he would hear the secret she had carried for so long. Patricia begged him not to go, terrified of what truths might surface, but Keanu held her face in his hands and spoke words that would echo through the rest of their story. He told her that love should not be a prison, that protection should not become punishment, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is face the ghosts we have been running from our entire lives. The plane touched down in Hawaii as the sun painted the ocean in shades of copper and gold, and Keanu felt his heart beating in rhythm with the waves he could see from his window. Patricia had stayed behind in Los Angeles, too afraid to face the mother she had exiled, too broken to witness the reunion she had prevented for 3 decades. The address from Margaret's latest letter led him to a small care facility nestled between palm trees that swayed like dancers in the warm breeze, and as he walked through the doors, he noticed how his hands trembled like leaves before a storm. Margaret Reeves was nothing like the monster his imagination had created from years of silence and secrets. She sat in a wheelchair by the window, her hair silver like moonlight, her eyes the same deep brown that Keanu saw in the mirror every morning. When she turned and saw him standing there, her face crumpled like paper, and the years seemed to flow backwards until he could almost see the grandmother who had been erased from his childhood. She reached out with hands that shook from more than just age, and when she spoke his name, it sounded like a prayer that had finally been answered. They sat together as the daylight faded, and Margaret began to unravel the tapestry of lies that had been woven to protect him. She spoke of his father, a man named Samuel who had started as a dreamer but had been pulled into a world of dangerous connections and deadly choices. The criminal organization he had become entangled with had threatened to use his family as leverage, to hurt Patricia and baby Keanu if Samuel did not comply with their demands. Margaret had been there the night Samuel made his final choice, the night he walked away from everything to keep his son safe, the night Patricia had blamed Margaret for introducing them in the first place. But the truth was more complex than blame could ever capture, and Margaret pulled out a box of her own, filled with photographs and documents that told a different story. There were pictures of Patricia sending updates about Keanu's life, school reports and movie reviews secretly mailed to Hawaii, birthday cards that were never signed but always arrived. Patricia had never truly cut her mother off. She had simply created a performance of separation so convincing that even she had started to believe it. The evidence showed years of silent communication, a daughter protecting her son while still honoring her mother, a love that found ways to exist even in exile. Margaret revealed that Samuel had not simply disappeared into the criminal underworld as Patricia believed. He had worked with federal agents to bring down the organization from within, accepting a deal that required him to vanish completely in exchange for his family's safety. He had died 10 years ago in witness protection, never knowing that his son had become the man the whole world admired, never seeing the red carpets where Patricia stood beside Keanu because Samuel could not. Margaret had kept this secret at Samuel's request, but now with death approaching, she could not leave Keanu believing his father had simply abandoned them. The revelation hit Keanu like a wave, washing away 30 years of assumptions and replacing them with a truth that was both heartbreaking and healing. His father had been a hero in the shadows, his mother had been a warrior in disguise, and his grandmother had been a guardian of secrets that were too dangerous to share until now. The 3 of them had formed a triangle of sacrifice, each protecting the others in the only ways they knew how, even if it meant living with broken hearts and unanswered questions. Margaret showed him one final thing, a letter from Samuel written just before he died, addressed to the son he had never been allowed to know. In it, he wrote about watching Keanu's movies from safe houses and hospital beds, about the pride that filled his chest when he read about his son's kindness and humility, about how he understood why Patricia brought her mother to those red carpet events even if she pretended they were estranged. Samuel had seen through the deception because he knew what love looked like when it had to hide, and he wanted Keanu to know that every choice had been made from love, even the ones that hurt. As Keanu read his father's words, he thought about all the times he had wondered why he felt incomplete despite his success, why he always felt like he was performing for an audience member who never showed up. Now he understood that his father had been watching all along, just from a distance that safety required, and that his mother had carried the weight of this knowledge alone to protect him from the burden of secrets that could have destroyed his life. The sacrifice was staggering, the love overwhelming, and Keanu found himself crying for the father he had never known and the mother who had known too much. Margaret was fading now, her energy depleted from sharing truths she had guarded for so long, but she had one more revelation that would change everything. She had been secretly funding a charity for single mothers in the entertainment industry, all in Patricia's name, for 20 years. Every struggling actress who had gotten an unexpected break, every single mother who had received anonymous help with rent or childcare, had been touched by Margaret's way of honoring the daughter who had sacrificed their relationship to protect her son. Patricia had never known that her mother had been her silent champion, turning pain into purpose and separation into service. The next morning, Keanu called his mother from Margaret's room, holding the phone between them so 3 generations could finally exist in the same space even if miles apart. Patricia's sobs echoed through the speaker as Margaret whispered forgiveness for choices that needed no apology, and love that had never actually died. They spoke until Margaret's voice grew too weak, until the sun set again on a day that had rewritten their entire history, until the only sound was breathing that connected them across ocean and time and the terrible distance that love sometimes demands. The Academy Awards ceremony was 2 weeks away when Keanu made a decision that would transform a night of celebration into something far more profound. He arranged for Margaret to be flown to Los Angeles, her medical team ensuring she could make the journey that her heart had been making for 30 years. Patricia did not know her mother was coming, and Keanu watched his own mother prepare for the red carpet with a nervous energy that had nothing to do with cameras and everything to do with the secret that was about to unfold beneath the Hollywood lights. The limousine arrived at Patricia's house as planned, but when Keanu helped her inside, she found herself face to face with the mother she had not seen in 3 decades. The 2 women stared at each other across the leather seats, and time seemed to stop, holding its breath while a daughter and mother remembered what it felt like to exist in the same space. Margaret reached out first, her frail hand crossing the distance that had seemed infinite, and when Patricia took it, both women began crying with the kind of tears that wash away years of pain in moments of grace. They arrived at the red carpet together, 3 generations stepping into the flashbulbs and shouting reporters, and Keanu felt the weight of the moment pressing against his chest like a hand over his heart. When the first interviewer asked why he had brought both women as his dates, Keanu began to speak, but the words came out different than he had planned. He found himself telling the story not of sacrifice and secrets, but of love that transcends understanding, of mothers who become shields and grandmothers who love from afar because proximity would mean danger. The crowd grew quiet as Keanu spoke, the usual red carpet chaos settling into something that felt sacred, like church had come to Hollywood for just one evening. He talked about his father, the ghost who had haunted their family by his absence, and how that absence had been his final gift to them. Reporters who usually hunted for scandal found themselves wiping away tears as Keanu explained how 3 people had lived in pain so that 1 child could live in safety, how his success was built on a foundation of sacrifice he had never known existed. But just as Keanu was explaining about the charity Margaret had been running, his grandmother's hand went cold in his, and her body slumped against Patricia's shoulder. The cameras kept rolling as Keanu and Patricia held Margaret between them, and the paramedics pushed through the crowd with a stretcher that seemed to move in slow motion. The last thing the cameras caught was Keanu kissing his grandmother's forehead before she disappeared into the ambulance, with Patricia holding her mother's hand like she would never let go again. The hospital waiting room became their new red carpet, and Keanu sat between Patricia and the wall of windows that looked out over a city that suddenly seemed very small. Margaret was stable but weak, and the doctors spoke in percentages and possibilities that meant everything and nothing at the same time. Patricia had not left her mother's side since they arrived, making up for 30 years of absence in hours of presence, whispering all the things she had saved up to say if she ever got the chance. On the second day, Margaret woke with a clarity that sometimes comes before the end, and she asked to speak to Keanu alone. She told him about the women she had helped through her charity, gave him names and stories that Patricia had never known, painted a picture of hundreds of lives changed because 1 grandmother had needed to channel her love somewhere when she could not give it directly to her family. She had kept records of every person helped, every life touched, and she wanted Keanu to know that Patricia's sacrifice had rippled outward in ways that neither of them could have imagined. Margaret revealed that several of Hollywood's most successful actresses had been single mothers who received help from her anonymous foundation during their struggling years. She had paid for acting classes, babysitters during auditions, rent when roles fell through, and even therapy when the weight of single parenthood became too heavy to carry alone. All of it had been done in Patricia's name, though Patricia had never known she was the patron saint of so many women who had walked paths similar to her own. One of those women was Elena Rodriguez, now a famous director who had been a struggling single mother 20 years ago when an anonymous check had saved her from eviction. Another was Sarah Kim, whose daughter had needed surgery that insurance would not cover until Margaret's foundation had stepped in. There were teachers who had become actresses, waitresses who had become writers, and single mothers who had simply become less alone because someone they never met had decided their struggles mattered. Margaret had one final request, and she made Keanu promise to fulfill it before she would rest. She wanted all the women her charity had helped to know the truth, to know that Patricia had been the inspiration even if she had not been the hand that signed the checks. She wanted her daughter to understand that their separation had created a legacy of connection, that their pain had become other people's possibility, and that sometimes love finds ways to work even when it cannot be seen or felt or held. Keanu made the calls himself over the next 3 days, reaching out to woman after woman with a story that sounded impossible but was entirely true. Each conversation revealed another layer of Margaret's secret kindness, another life saved by a grandmother who had transformed her exile into service. By the time he had contacted everyone on the list, word had spread through Hollywood about what Margaret had done, and the hospital began filling with flowers and cards from women who wanted to thank the stranger who had saved them. Patricia sat in the middle of it all, overwhelmed by the discovery that her mother had been loving her from a distance in ways she had never imagined. Every woman who had been helped was, in some way, a version of Patricia, a single mother trying to make something beautiful from struggle, and Margaret had loved them all as surrogate daughters when she could not love her own directly. The charity had been named simply the Silent Guardian Foundation, but everyone who had been touched by it had felt the very personal nature of its care. The morning Margaret passed away was quiet in the way that sacred moments often are, with sunlight streaming through the hospital window like heaven was already reaching down to welcome her home. Patricia was holding one hand and Keanu was holding the other, and somewhere between one breath and the next, the grandmother who had loved from a distance finally let go. There were no dramatic last words or sudden revelations, just a gentle release that felt like watching a bird finally take flight after years of waiting at the edge of the nest. Patricia did not cry at first, instead sitting in a stillness that seemed to hold all the tears she had not allowed herself to shed for 30 years. Keanu watched his mother watching her mother, and he understood in that moment that grief is not always loud, that sometimes it is the quietest thing in the room, too deep for sound. They sat together as the nurses came and went, as the machines were turned off one by one, as the body that had housed so much love became simply a shell left behind by a spirit that had finally found freedom. The memorial service was held 3 weeks later in a small church overlooking the Pacific Ocean, the same waves that had separated this family now serving as the backdrop for their reunion in remembrance. Keanu had expected perhaps 50 people to attend, friends from the care facility, and a few distant relatives who had lost touch over the years. But when he arrived at the church, he found it overflowing with hundreds of women he had never met, all of them holding single white roses, all of them crying for a woman who had saved them without ever revealing her name. They came from every corner of the entertainment industry, actresses and writers and directors and producers, all of them single mothers who had once been struggling until an anonymous angel had lifted them up. Elena Rodriguez spoke first, telling the crowd how Margaret had paid for the acting classes that had launched her career when she could barely afford food for her daughter. Sarah Kim followed, describing how her daughter's surgery had been covered by a mysterious benefactor who had asked for nothing in return, except that Sarah pay it forward someday. One by one, the women shared their stories, and Keanu watched his mother transform with each testimony. Patricia was seeing her own struggles reflected in every face, understanding for the first time that her sacrifice had created ripples she could never have imagined. Margaret had taken the pain of separation and alchemized it into purpose, had taken the love she could not give directly and scattered it across hundreds of deserving hearts. Every woman standing in that church was proof that suffering can become service, that isolation can become inspiration, and that love always finds a way even when every door seems closed. Keanu stepped to the podium after the last woman had spoken, and he looked out at the sea of faces that represented his grandmother's secret legacy. He announced that he would be establishing the Patricia and Margaret Foundation, an organization dedicated to continuing the work that his grandmother had started in the shadows. The foundation would support single mothers in all creative industries, providing not just financial assistance, but also mentorship and community, ensuring that no one would have to struggle alone the way Patricia had believed she was struggling all those years ago. Patricia stood beside him as he made the announcement, and for the first time since Margaret had passed, she allowed herself to cry openly. These were not tears of grief alone, but tears of healing, of understanding, of finally seeing the full picture of a story she had only known in fragments. Her mother had never stopped loving her, had never stopped protecting her, had simply found different ways to express what could not be said directly. The separation that Patricia had believed was necessary had been transformed by Margaret into a mission that touched hundreds of lives. 6 months later, Keanu and Patricia arrived at the Academy Awards together, and when the familiar question came about why he always brought his mother as his date, Keanu was ready with an answer that silenced the entire red carpet. He spoke about the promise in the spotlight, about how his mother had spent decades standing beside him not because she wanted fame or recognition, but because she had sacrificed her own mother to keep him safe. He explained that every red carpet walk was Patricia's way of honoring the years she had spent alone, the connection she had given up, and the love she had buried to protect her son. But this time, he added something new, telling the world that his mother was not just his date but his hero, his teacher, and his reminder that true courage is not found in action movies, but in the quiet choices we make when no one is watching. He spoke about Margaret, about Samuel, about a family that had been separated by love and reunited by loss, about secrets that had protected him and sacrifices that had shaped him. By the time he finished speaking, there was not a dry eye on the red carpet, and even the most hardened journalists found themselves moved by a story that was about something far bigger than celebrity. When asked what he had learned from all of this, Keanu paused and looked at his mother with eyes full of gratitude and grace. He said that he had learned that the greatest roles we play are not on screen, that they are the ones where we choose forgiveness when bitterness would be easier, where we protect those we love even when protection means pain, and where we honor the sacrifices that were made in silence so that we could stand in the spotlight. He said that his grandmother had taught him that love does not die when it is hidden. It simply finds new ways to grow, and that his mother had taught him that strength is not the absence of fear but the presence of purpose. Ending reflection. This story reminds us that behind every successful person stands a legacy of sacrifice we may never fully understand. Keanu Reeves brings his mother to every red carpet not just as a date, but as a living tribute to a woman who gave up her own mother so her son could be safe. The lesson here is simple but profound, that kindness ripples outward in ways we cannot see, that forgiveness heals wounds we did not know we carried, and that the people who love us most are often the ones who sacrifice in silence. May we all learn to honor those who stood in the shadows so we could dance in the light, and may we have the courage to transform our own pain into purpose, just as Margaret did, creating circles of love that continue long after we are gone.